I never imagined that my own blood would be the one to betray me so deeply. At 65 years old, after spending my entire life working, saving, and fighting for every small comfort I had, I thought I knew what trust meant. I thought I knew who I could count on. But one phone call tore the ground out from under me and revealed the cruelest truth I have ever faced. It started on a Monday morning, quiet and still, the kind of morning where the ticking of the clock feels louder than anything else. I was sipping my tea, staring out the window at the garden I'd nurtured for decades, when the phone rang. It wasn't unusual, but the voice on the other end instantly chilled me. A man introduced himself as a representative from the bank, his tone cold and professional. He said, "Mrs. Anna Miller, we need to confirm your repayment plan for the $250,000 loan you took out last month." My hands froze on the cup. I nearly dropped it. My heart started hammering in my chest so loud I could barely hear the man's words anymore. A loan, $250,000. I stammered, trying to find my voice, but the only thing that came out was a broken whisper. "What loan?" The man was firm. He read out my full name, my social security number, my address. He had everything. According to the documents, I had signed the loan papers, except I hadn't. My entire body went cold as I realized what this meant. Someone had stolen my identity. But as the man continued, something inside me twisted in the ugliest way possible. He mentioned the guarantor, the contact person who had vouched for the paperwork. It was my son, Daniel. I felt as if lightning had struck me. My own son, my Daniel, the boy I had raised with trembling hands after his father passed away, the boy I sacrificed for, worked overtime for, skipped meals for, prayed for every single night. He had been the one to take out a loan in my name. I tried to convince myself there had to be a mistake. Maybe Daniel had been tricked. Maybe he was protecting me. Maybe he didn't know. But the evidence was impossible to deny. The representative told me the funds had already been transferred, and the debt was mine unless I could prove fraud. My name, my credit, my life ruined. When I hung up the phone, my tea was cold. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely stand. I waited for hours until Daniel came home, my mind racing, my stomach twisting. When he finally walked through the door, casual and carefree, like nothing had happened, I felt a rage burn inside me that I had never known before. I asked him, my voice shaking, "Daniel, what have you done?" He looked at me, confused at first. But then I saw it, the flicker of guilt in his eyes. So fast and small, I might have missed it if I hadn't been his mother. He said, "Mom, I don't know what you're talking about." But I pressed him. My voice cracked as I told him about the phone call, the loan, the bank. That was when his mask slipped. His shoulders sagged, and his voice dropped lower, almost defensive, as he muttered, "I needed the money. I didn't think you'd find out so soon." Those words cut deeper than any knife ever could. He didn't think I'd find out so soon. He admitted it without shame, as if it was just another mistake. I shouted, $250,000, Daniel. Do you realize what you've done? Do you realize what this means for me? And he had the audacity to look back at me and say, You're overreacting. I'll pay it back. Overreacting. My whole life's stability, my safety in old age, my home, everything I had worked for, was now hanging by a thread because of him. And he called it overreacting. I went to bed that night unable to breathe, my chest heavy with pain. I stared at the ceiling, wondering how the boy I loved more than anything could do this to me. Every memory of his childhood, every smile, every laugh, it all felt poisoned. I couldn't sleep. My thoughts spun like a tornado, one question pounding in my head. Why? The next day, I confronted him again. I needed to know where the money had gone. At first, he dodged my questions, packing around the kitchen like a trapped animal. But when I refused to back down, he finally blurted it out. He said he'd invested part of it in some business opportunity with his friends. The rest, he admitted, was already gone, blown away on parties, gambling, and luxuries. I felt sick. My own son had dragged me into financial ruin, not because he was desperate or dying, but because he was careless, selfish, greedy. I tried to reason with him. I begged him to call the bank with me, to admit the fraud, to set things straight before it was too late. But he shook his head, refusing, saying it would ruin his future if he admitted what he'd done. His future. And what about mine? At 65 years old, I was supposed to start worrying about whether I could keep a roof over my head, all because of him. That was when something inside me hardened. A fire I didn't know I had started burning in my chest. I realized that if Daniel wouldn't fix this, then I had no choice but to protect myself. I had been a loving mother, forgiving too many times, covering for his mistakes. But this was unforgivable. I looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see my son. I saw a man who had betrayed me, a man who thought he could use me as a shield for his recklessness. And in that moment, I swore to myself that he would regret it. That night, lying in bed, I planned. I planned everything. Every lie he had told me over the years started connecting like pieces of a puzzle. Every late night, every missing dollar, every excuse. I finally saw him for what he was, and I promised myself if he wanted to use me, if he wanted to destroy me, then I would show him that even at 65, I was not a woman to be broken. I didn't sleep that night. Not a single minute. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind running in circles, replaying every detail of the last 24 hours. The betrayal, the coldness in Daniel's eyes, the way he dismissed me as though my entire life's savings were nothing more than pocket change. For 65 years, I had been patient, forgiving, the one who always smoothed things over. But now, every nerve in my body screamed for justice. No, justice wasn't enough. What I wanted was retribution. By sunrise, I had made my decision. If my son was going to gamble away my future, then I would take his future apart piece by piece. The first step was knowledge. I needed to know exactly what he had done and where that money had gone. I couldn't trust his excuses anymore. So I dressed, grabbed my notebook, and went into the living room, waiting for him to leave. When he finally stumbled out of his room, groggy and hungover, he barely noticed me watching him. He muttered something about meeting friends and left. The moment the door shut, I sprang into action. I went straight to his room. For years, I had respected his privacy, even when I suspected trouble. But that day, I tore through his belongings with a cold precision I didn't know I had. Drawers, closets, the nightstand, nothing was off limits. And there it was. Receipts, dozens of them. Casino entries, expensive bars, electronic stores, clothing boutiques. He had been living like a king while I scraped by on my pension. My hands shook as I wrote everything down in my notebook, each receipt another nail in his coffin. Then I found something even worse. A small folder tucked beneath his mattress, filled with business papers, contracts with his so-called friends who promised quick profits if he invested in their ventures. I read them carefully, my eyes narrowing with every line. They weren't contracts, they were scams. Every single page screamed fraud, full of loopholes that guaranteed Daniel would never see his money again. He had fallen for it. Or maybe, deep down, he didn't care as long as the money wasn't his. That was when I realized the full depth of my son's recklessness. Not only had he stolen from me, he had thrown it all into the fire, trusting people who saw him as nothing more than a fool with easy access to cash. And that, I decided, was the key to my revenge. If Daniel thought he could trick me, then I would trick him right back. If he thought his friends were loyal, I would prove they were snakes waiting to bite. I wouldn't just confront him. I would destroy the illusion he lived in, piece by piece, until he had nothing left. The next days were a blur of quiet planning. I played the part of the weak, aging mother, pretending to believe his lies while secretly building a case against him. I visited the bank, carefully explaining my situation. They confirmed everything. The loan was real, and legally it was tied to my name. But when I asked about fraud investigations, I noticed something. Daniel had forged my signature sloppily. The handwriting was close, but not perfect. A trained eye could see the difference. That was my weapon. If I played this right, I could prove fraud, clear my name, and let Daniel take the fall. But it wouldn't be enough. No, I didn't just want freedom from the debt. I wanted him to feel the weight of betrayal, the same crushing weight he had put on me. So I decided to bait him. I started asking him small questions at dinner, pretending to be clueless. "How's that business going with your friends, Daniel?" I'd say sweetly, hiding the venom in my voice. His eyes would light up, and he'd spin tailies about how close they were to a big breakthrough, how soon the profits would roll in. I nodded, smiling, while inside I thought, "Keep talking, son. Every lie you tell me is another thread I'll pull when it's time to unravel you." The hook came one evening when I mentioned casually that I had spoken to the bank again. His fork froze halfway to his mouth. He tried to play it off, asking what they had said, his voice shaky. I told him they offered me options if I wanted to make repayments sooner. I lied, saying I might even sell the house. The panic in his eyes was everything I needed. He needed me to hold onto that loan because if I exposed the truth, he would be finished. That fear was my leverage. And so, I set the second stage of my plan into motion. I began visiting his so-called business partners. I tracked down their names from the contracts and made calls, pretending to be an interested investor. Most ignored me, but a few couldn't resist bragging. They admitted their business was little more than a front, a game they played with gullible people like Daniel. They laughed about him, called him stupid behind his back. I wrote down every word, every insult, every detail, because soon I would deliver those words straight to him. And I wanted him to hear exactly how little his friends thought of him. But even as I built my arsenal, a part of me couldn't ignore the ache in my chest. This was my son, my Daniel, the boy whose hand I once held as he took his first steps, the boy whose fever I stayed up all night to watch over. I should have been protecting him, not plotting against him. And yet, the betrayal was too deep. He hadn't just made a mistake. He had chosen to sacrifice me for his greed. He had looked me in the eye and lied over and over again. That wasn't my son anymore. That was a stranger wearing his face. The climax of chapter 2 came one night when he came home late, reeking of alcohol. I watched from the kitchen table as he stumbled through the door, dropping his jacket on the floor. He barely noticed me sitting there, the light from the lamp casting shadows across the room. I said quietly, "Daniel, do you ever think about what you've done to me?" He looked at me annoyed. "Mom, not this again. I told you I'll fix it." I leaned forward, my voice calm but sharp as a knife. "No, Daniel, you won't fix it, because I've already started." His face went pale. Started what? I smiled then, a smile I didn't recognize on my own lips. Started taking back my life. And you, my son, are about to lose yours. He blinked at me, confused, afraid, angry. He muttered something under his breath and stormed off to his room, slamming the door. But I sat there, steady, my heart pounding with a strange new strength. For the first time in years, I felt powerful. He didn't know it yet, but the storm had already begun. And soon it would consume him. The hook that kept me awake until dawn was simple. I would not be his victim. I would become his reckoning. The morning after my declaration, the air in the house felt different. Heavy. Tense. Daniel avoided me at breakfast, his eyes darting anywhere but my face. I could feel the fear growing in him, though he tried to hide it beneath that careless smirk he always wore. But I wasn't playing anymore. For 65 years, I had been the forgiving mother. Now, I was the executioner. The first strike had to be precise. Public humiliation. Nothing wounds Daniel more than being exposed as a fool. So I began with his friends. I called one of them Mark, the smooth-talking scammer whose name was all over those contracts. I introduced myself as Daniel's concerned mother, pretending I wanted to invest. My voice trembled just enough to sound naive, to play the role of the gullible old woman. "Oh, Mrs. Turner," he said with fake warmth, "your son's doing great with us. You should be proud. We're on the verge of a big payout." I smiled to myself. Perfect. I let him talk, let him brag, all while recording the conversation on my phone. He admitted, without hesitation, that Daniel had given them almost every cent of the $250,000. He even laughed and said, "Kid's desperate. Easy money, if you ask me." That was the dagger I needed. Later that day, I set up a meeting with Daniel. I told him we needed to go over finances. He rolled his eyes, but agreed, probably thinking he could charm me into silence. We sat at the kitchen table, just like always. He leaned back in his chair, cocky, confident, sipping his coffee. I placed my phone on the table, pressed play, and let his friend's voice fill the room. At first, he didn't react. Then his jaw clenched. His hands curled into fists. His confidence shattered as Mark's mocking laughter spilled from the speaker. "They're using you, Daniel," I said calmly. "Every single one of them. You thought you were smart, but you're nothing to them. Just a fool with access to his mother's signature." He exploded. "You don't understand. They promised me." "Promised you?" I cut him off. "Like you promised me I'd be safe. Like you promised to take care of me after Dad died." The silence that followed was deafening. His face went red, then pale. For the first time, I saw something new in his eyes, shame. But shame wouldn't save him. This was only the beginning. That night, I drafted letters to the bank, to the authorities, to anyone who would listen. I included copies of the forged signature, the receipts, the recordings. Piece by piece, I was building a noose around Daniel's neck. Still, a part of me hesitated. Was I really ready to send my son to prison? Could I live with that? But then I remembered the weight of the debt, the sleepless nights, the betrayal in his smirk. And my hesitation turned to steel. The next blow had to cut deeper. So I went to his workplace. Daniel had a job, well, at least on paper. He worked at a small marketing firm, though from what I knew, he barely showed up. I walked into the office, clutching my folder of evidence. His boss, a tired-looking man in his 40s, welcomed me politely. "I need you to know who you've hired," I said, and laid everything out on his desk. The man's eyes widened as he flipped through the documents. He frowned, then sighed. "Mrs. Turner, this is serious. If what you're saying is true, he won't be working here much longer." By the time I left, I knew I had just stripped Daniel of his job. Another piece of his world crumbling, another safety net gone. When he came home that evening, he was furious. "What the hell did you do, Mom?" he screamed, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. "I told the truth," I replied coldly. "Something you've forgotten how to do." His rage was volcanic. He threw a chair across the room, punched the wall until his knuckles bled. But I didn't flinch. Not once. I simply watched, calm as stone, as he realized the walls were closing in. And then I struck again. The very next day, I invited a few of his so-called friends over under the pretense of talking business. Daniel didn't know. I greeted them warmly, served them tea, played the doting mother. And then, with Daniel standing in the doorway, I turned on my phone again and played the recordings for all to hear. Mark's voice mocking him, another friend's laughter, every word dripping with betrayal. The room froze. Daniel's face drained of color. His friends shifted uncomfortably, caught in their own lies. "Get out," I said to them, my voice sharp as glass. "You've stolen enough from my family. Leave before I call the police." They scattered like rats. Daniel stood there, trembling, humiliated, staring at me with wide, broken eyes. "You destroyed me," he whispered. "No," I said, my voice calm but merciless. "You destroyed yourself. I'm just showing you the mirror." That night, he didn't come home. I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair where he used to sit, feeling the weight of victory pressing down on me. But it wasn't satisfaction, not yet, because this wasn't over. The debt was still in my name. The bank still wanted its money, and Daniel still had his freedom. The real revenge had only just begun. I never thought the day would come when I'd stand in the middle of my own living room, looking into my son's eyes, and finally feel nothing but cold resolve. For weeks, I had been drowning in shame, debt, and heartbreak. My son, the boy I had raised with trembling hands and endless love, had betrayed me in a way no mother should ever have to endure. A $250,000 loan. On my name. On my shoulders. My life's peace shattered because of his greed. But something had changed in me. I was no longer the weak, desperate woman begging for answers. I had become someone sharper, someone unbreakable. And now, it was time for him to see who he was truly dealing with. He stood there, his arms crossed as if he still owned this house, this family, this life. He looked at me like I was the fool, the obstacle standing in the way of his dreams. My son said with a bitter smirk that I should stop acting like the victim, that he would handle it, that I should trust him. That one sentence nearly made me laugh. Trust. After he stole my name, my dignity, and my peace, I let him talk, let him spin his excuses. But inside, I was already pulling the strings of the plan I had carefully set in motion. I reminded myself of all those sleepless nights, the harassing phone calls from the bank, the whispers from neighbors who had heard rumors, the way I had hidden in my own kitchen to cry so no one could see me break. And now, here he was, standing in front of me, thinking he could talk his way out of it. I told him I had forgiven him. My voice cracked in just the right way, soft and trembling, like an old mother too tired to fight. He believed me, of course, He always believed I was weak. He always thought I'd fold. That was his mistake. Because while he smiled and leaned back in his chair, confident that I had let it go, I was watching the clock. In less than 20 minutes, the call I had set up with the bank and the police would begin. They were waiting for my signal, the final proof that he was inside my house, still pretending to be untouchable. But before that moment came, I wanted him to hear it from me. I wanted him to understand just how deep his betrayal cut. So I told him. I told him that I had heard every word he whispered to his so-called friends about how stupid his mother was, about how she'd always cover for him, about how she'd never have the guts to fight back. I told him I had seen the papers, every signature, every lie. I told him I had looked into the mirror every morning and barely recognized myself, because the woman staring back at me was broken by her own child. His smile faltered. He told me to calm down, that I was making a big deal out of nothing. Nothing. That word burned into my chest. Nothing, when my entire life had been ripped apart. Nothing, when I had to choose between food and another bank payment. Nothing, when I had aged 10 years in the span of 1 month from the stress. My voice rose, stronger than it had in years. I told him he had destroyed me, but he had underestimated me. He didn't know that I had been collecting evidence. Every message, every receipt, every call. I had handed it all to the right people. And right on cue, the knock at the door echoed through the house like a final judgment. His face went pale, and for the first time in a long time, I saw fear in his eyes. Not arrogance, not bravado fear. The police entered, their voices firm, their presence overwhelming. He turned to me, wide-eyed, asking if I had done this, if I had really called them on my own son. I looked him straight in the eyes and told him the truth. I said yes. I said a mother's love has limits, and he had crossed every single one. I said I wasn't going to let him ruin what little life I had left. He shouted, cursed, swore that I would regret this, but his words no longer pierced me. They bounced off like meaningless noise. As they put the cuffs on him, as they read him his rights, I stood taller than I had in years. For the first time, I wasn't the broken woman he thought he could control. I was free, but freedom wasn't enough. Justice wasn't enough. I wanted him to feel the weight of what he had done, to sit in that cell and know his mother had been the one to put him there. So, as they led him out, I whispered just loud enough for him to hear, "This is only the beginning. You took my name, but you will never take my strength again." The door closed behind him, and the silence that followed was heavier than any sound I had ever heard. I walked to the window, watching as the car drove away, carrying with it the son I had once cradled in my arms. My heart broke again, but this time it wasn't the same. This break was clean, sharp, and final. The days that followed were a blur of reporters, paperwork, and endless calls. But I didn't hide anymore. I spoke. I told the truth. I let the world know that I had been betrayed, but I had fought back. My neighbors looked at me differently now, not with pity, but with respect. And for once, I held my head high when I walked down the street. And yet, late at night, when the house grew quiet and the shadows stretched long, I would sit in my chair and think about the boy I once knew. The boy who used to hold my hand when crossing the street. The boy who used to whisper, "Good night" before bed. That boy was gone, swallowed whole by greed and lies. All that was left was a man who thought he could destroy me. But he was wrong, because in the end, I was still standing. I was still fighting. And I had taken back my power in the most brutal way possible. My revenge wasn't just the prison walls that would now surround him. It was the unshakable truth that he had underestimated me, and it had cost him everything. And as I sat there, the weight of it all finally settling, I realized something I never thought I'd say out loud. I wasn't just his mother anymore. I was his reckoning.